collected it earlier. So.
Great. Okay.
Thanks.
So I think everybody should be coming in. I think that we have, let's see, we have 54 participants. We'll just wait maybe one more minute. And while we wait for everybody to join, if one of our co-hosts can keep admitting people, I will begin with a couple of housekeeping announcements. So before Ashwata Manohar takes over as a session chair and brings our conversation forward, I just wanted to share a few technical announcements to make sure that our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. So firstly, I want to mention that this session will be recorded and posted on the ANH website following the conference, so keep that in mind. Second, all participants have been muted, but please introduce yourselves using the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Let us know your name, where you are joining us from, and the organization you work with. The chat button is again at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we encourage you to share your webcam video during this session so that we're not speaking into a void, and we'd love to see your faces, but if you prefer not to, you can add a profile picture so that we can see your smiling faces. So that when your video is off, instead of just seeing your name, we'll see your picture. And you can do this by right-clicking on your name in the Zoom window and clicking Add Profile Photo. Later in the session, we will open up the conversation with a Q&A. If you have questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we will do our best to raise them during the Q&A session. If we have time, we may have participants raise their hands so we can call on you and unmute you so that you can speak your question aloud. Last, if at any point you experience technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection, and you can always try to reconnect to the session using the Zoom link. If you have a technical question, you can send me, Philia Sparling, a private message using the chat box. Thank you so much, and over to you, Dr. Shweta Manohar.
Thanks, Talia. Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, everybody. My name is Shweta Manohar. I am a fellow with Johns Hopkins University SAIS. I'm happy to be able to chair this session today, and I just want to welcome all of you and our presenters to this parallel session titled Ag to Nutrition Implementation Science Studies, and it's session B. There's another parallel session going on, which is session A, so just to make sure you're in the right space, but I think this is the space to be. So this session is specifically dedicated to examining lessons learned from a design, implementation, and evaluation of either complex programs and or testing interventions. So to start off, I just want to introduce our speakers briefly. We have Philip James, Emily Farber, Pepin Schreinemakers, Sujana Medati, and Tracy Morse. I will, introduce them with their affiliation and topics soon, but just to start us off, I'm going to take a look at the poll. I don't know if everybody's been able to answer. There's a poll in progress. I see there's only one respondent. Or, okay, no, it's changed now. That's great. Okay, so we have a varying distribution for how many pre-recorded oral sessions for this session that have been watched already. Many of you, I think it seems like closer to half of you have only listened to one. So what we have today is the opportunity to get a quick overview of each of the abstracts. And each of the presenters will have about 3 minutes to introduce their abstract topic and their study. So without further ado, I think I should start us on this. Okay, so we're going to start off with Philip James, who is from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. His presentation is titled Effect of Nutrition Sensitive Agricultural Interventions with Participatory Videos and Women's Group Meetings on Maternal and Child Nutritional Outcomes, the Ukhondo trial. It's a 4-arm cluster randomized control trial in rural Odisha in India. If you all had the chance later to listen to this presentation, that would be great. I particularly appreciated how their entire research team had about 2 minutes to present their work, and so that was nice to see. But I'm going to hand over now to Philip, and just to remind you that you have 3 minutes, and I'll be timing you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction and for telling us the first slide. I'm speaking today on behalf of a large group of researchers and implementers. So Ukhondo was a complex behavior change communication intervention, and it looked at agricultural extension using participatory videos through the medium of women's self-help groups. These videos were made nutrition sensitive and made as participatory as possible. So I'm giving you the results today from a 32-month intervention from a 4-arm cluster randomized controlled trial. So we have a control arm, and then we have 3 intervention arms. Each of the intervention arms had 2 events per month. So arm 1, the agri arm, had 2 nutrition sensitive agriculture video screenings per month. Arm 2, agri-nut, had 1 NSA video and then 1 nutrition specific video on maternal or child nutrition topics. Arm 3, the agri-nut and PLA arm, either had one nutrition sensitive agriculture video and then either 1 nutrition specific video or a cycle of participatory learning and action. So to recap the main evaluation findings from the trial, for the primary outcomes, the agri-nut arm and the agri-nut and PLA arms both improved child minimum dietary diversity by 19% and by 27% respectively. There was no improvement on maternal BMI. For the secondary outcomes, we see arm 1, agri-arm, and arm 3, agri-nut and PLA, both improved maternal minimum dietary diversity by 21% and by 30% respectively. We saw no impact on child wasting. We see that arms 2 and 3 both improved child minimum acceptable diet. Arm 1, the agri-arm, improved decision making and net value of agriculture production. The trial also had a process and an economic evaluation. We find overall that our trial results suggest enhancing nutrition sensitivity and participatory components of agricultural interventions can indeed improve dietary quality. We did find large effect sizes for both maternal and child minimum dietary diversity over and above a large secular change. However, for child wasting and maternal BMI, we advocate for continued investment in, coordination and convergence of multi-sectoral programming. So with that, I'd like to invite others from the intervention implementation team to join me in answering your questions. I know we have Sunita and Vinali available for that as well. Thank you very much.
Right, excellent timing. So I'm not sure, I'm trying to decide whether we want to take questions at the end with the entire panel, but maybe what I'll do is I'll give 5 minutes for questions now, and then we'll have the entire panel come back on at the end, should people have further questions. So for now, if anybody has a question, go ahead, but maybe I'll start off with a question that has come up. And so the question is, why do you think you saw a mediating effect of knowledge in the modest improvement strata, but did not observe the same relationship in the strongest program effect group? And if you wanted to speak more to that.
Could you repeat the question one more time? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So the question was, why do you think you saw a mediating effect of knowledge in the modest improvement strata, but did not observe the same relationship in the strongest program effect group.
I think that's not for this trial, actually. I think that's for Emily.
Sorry, I realized that. Okay, well, I had a question that I wrote down, and well, there's several now coming in as well. So one of the questions were, what were the participatory components in the intervention, and what do you think was the mechanism behind the positive impact of this?
Renali, I've unmuted you. Can I invite you to answer this, please? Seeing if I can't seem to unmute you, Renali. Sunita, would you like to take this instead?
Hello, Phil, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can. Thank you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so the project itself is a participatory one. The contents and the topics which we want to disseminate and which we want to communicate to the community were decided by the community itself, because once the research questions are formulated, then we discussed this with the community through different tools. Like one is formative research, where we try to identify the existing barriers and facilitating factors in the community. There are also other participatory tools like participatory learning action cycle, where the community itself, the member itself, identify the messages and the practices which need everyone's input, and they need help in that. So the entire research design, the intervention design, so to say, is around different participatory approaches and tools. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think as a follow-on to that, there's another question about the nutrition components of the NSA training sessions and your reflections on the lack of dietary improvement in the NSA group alone. And I don't know who on the team might want to take that. The question is coming from Julia De Bruyne.
This is Sunita. Phil, if you can go back to the results slide, it would be helpful to anchor the discussion a bit in terms of arms and the effect sizes and so on. Yeah. So the question is, why didn't we see an impact on the agri versus control arm for the child minimum dietary diversity? Yeah. Could you repeat the question, Sweta? Sorry.
Sure. So it's just, I think they're wondering why the nutrition components of the NSA training sessions, why there was a lack of dietary improvement in that NSA only group.
Right. We didn't see an improvement in child dietary diversity, but we did see on maternal minimum dietary diversity. So yeah, and why, we don't know. We don't know what to speculate on. What we want to think about, and this has been found in other kind of trials as well, that if you don't have nutrition related social behavior change communications, nutrition specific in terms of these, I mean, I can only speculate on what might have happened, and we will be looking at process evaluation results. But in the first arm, just where they received the NSA or nutrition sensitive videos and that intervention, it might be that, translation of, these production of better foods might be inhibited by a lack of, let's say, resources and knowledge or capacity around how to translate that to infant feeding, which they do get in the other two arms. So probably because infant feeding is different, and the norms surrounding that and how parents deal with that is different from if I were a woman and I'm growing a carrot and me eating a carrot, versus whether I would give that to a child or not, perhaps. But a great question, and we need to look at that in our subsequent analyses. Thank you.
I'm going to take one big picture question and then we'll move on to the next presentation. But this question is from Alan Dangor, and it was a question that I also had when looking at the results. And I think many of the different trials in this session, I sort of was thinking this about the effects on dietary diversity are described as large, or there's some kind of significant result, but are they important? And will they improve outcomes in women and children? And this might be a question that is a thread across the different trials that are talked about today. But does anybody have, from your team, have insights on this?
I'm pretty sure. Helen, do you want to take that? Can someone unmute Helen if she's there? Helen Harris-Fry. I don't want to be the only one talking, so. Or Phil, if you want to answer that too. So I thought.
Whilst Helen's been unmuted, yeah, I think it's a question we're asking ourselves. We see these improvements in dietary diversity. They haven't translated into anthropometric improvements. However, we know from other studies that increased dietary diversity does associate with increased dietary adequacy, and in many cases is backed up by biomarker measures. So it might be, are we looking at the right outcomes? For example, have we not picked up on some other measures of dietary adequacy? And this question of translating into anthropometric outcomes is a big one, and I think it will be a theme, and we're grappling with that at the moment. Helen, do you want to add anything?
Hi, yeah, thanks. Thank you for the question. It is one that we've been thinking about. Dietary diversity scores have been developed as an indicator, as Phil said, they were developed as an indicator specifically of micronutrient adequacy. And I would say that I think that is important in and of itself. It's important to have a good and healthy diet. And the question as to whether it's important beyond that is one that's quite difficult to answer. Certainly linking it to anthropometry is very problematic. The links between dietary diversity among children and child anthropometry are quite weak and mixed, and the links between dietary diversity and maternal anthropometry are even less convincing. And I would say the same goes for maternal hemoglobin. So the question, I suppose, is, are we seeing dietary diversity and micronutrient adequacy as a means to an end, or an outcome in and of itself? And I think it is an important outcome in and of itself. And the other thing I would point out in Alan's question was that they're described as large, but are they important? I think it's not just the fact that these were significant, but that we've seen they are large, especially compared to other studies from other places that have seen improvements in dietary diversity. But what we're showing is really quite large and impressive, I think.
Thank you for that, Helen. So with that question, I'm going to move on to our next presenter so that we can listen to everyone over here. So the next presenter is Emily Farber, who I was very excited to ask a question to, apparently. Sorry about that. I already asked her a question. But Emily is from Emory University, and her presentation is titled A Nutrition-Sensitive Orange-Fleshed Sweet Potato Project in Southern Ethiopia Improves Complementary Feeding Practices. And I will let her start off.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak here and for the introduction and the sneak peek at my question. So my name's Emily. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Emory in Atlanta. And this research is looking at examination of impact pathways of an orange-fleshed sweet potato project. And the project is titled the Quality Diets for Better Health Project. And its overall goal or objective is to improve the quality of infant and young child diets. And the project aims to improve diets by two pathways. The first is a food security pathway through which the project promotes the adoption of orange-fleshed sweet potatoes, which are high in vitamin A. And the second is a caregiver knowledge or ability pathway, which the project aims to improve through community-based nutrition education. And in addition to these two components of the intervention, we had a subgroup, which we call the full intervention, that received a feeding toolkit comprised of a feeding bowl and spoon that promote age-appropriate portion sizes and complementary food consistency. So we were able to also test the added benefit. I'm going to jump right into our results in the interest of time here. We found that both the partial and full intervention groups improved caregiver nutrition knowledge and household food security. However, it was the caregiver nutrition knowledge that translated to an improved complementary feeding index that we computed based on individual indicators. However, in addition to this mediating effect of caregiver nutrition knowledge, we saw a strong direct effect of the full intervention, that's the group that received the toolkit, on the complementary feeding index. We saw similar results for minimum meal frequency, portion size, and complementary food consistency. Dietary diversity was a little bit different, and with this outcome, we saw mediation working through household food security rather than knowledge, and we still saw a significant direct effect. Our impacts were strongest at our midline survey, which was about 7 months after the baseline and was also during the food insecure season. So with that, I think I'm running out of time, so I'll say thank you and acknowledge the European Union who funded this research and our implementing partners, which are People in Need and the International Potato Center.
All right, thank you, Emily. So yeah, why don't we have you respond to the question that I initially asked, which is, what do you think, why do you think you saw a mediating effect of knowledge in the modest improvement strata, but did not observe the same relationship in the strongest program effect group?
Yeah, so I'm gonna put up this slide because I'm a visual person here. So we actually, and this slide doesn't have the betas just because I thought it might be a little bit too much for this brief overview, but the magnitude of the indirect effect that was operating sort of through this nutrition knowledge was actually quite similar in both the partial and the full intervention group. And so what that basically means is that we found that the improved complementary feeding index improved to approximately the same degree as explained by caregiver nutrition knowledge. However, in addition, what we saw was an additional direct effect that was not explained by either mediator, and that was only present in the full intervention group, and that was the group that received those feeding tools. And the tools had been developed in accordance with the health belief model, which places value on having cues to action, and so we would suggest that perhaps the tools did act just as they were intended to, as a cue to action. And this sort of reinforces what we already know about behavior change, and that is that knowledge is not the only thing that matters for behavior change, is that we have to create an enabling environment in addition to just telling people what they should do, or, you know, that certain complementary feeding practices are good for their child. It takes more than just having the quote unquote knowledge. So we think that's kind of an interesting finding and what we would hypothesize.
Thanks, Emily. And we also have another question from Naomi Seville from Nepal. It's a more methodological question to explain a little bit more about your analytic approach to tease out mediating factors and direct impacts.
Sure. So I actually have some appendix slides, so it might pop up there. So the analytical approach that we used, I used M+ as for the analyses. And there's a command in M+ called the model indirect command, the model indirect command, that essentially computes the indirect and direct effects. And so it basically is like a simultaneous calculation of several different betas in the model. And there's some additional information up here, such as that we used bootstrapped standard errors, which don't make assumptions about the distribution of your errors. And we use Bonferroni corrected confidence intervals. But I think, it sounds like the main question is getting at, you know, the nuts and bolts of the analysis. And so we use this M+ program, which is often used for latent variable modeling or structural equation modeling, but in this case, we used it for the mediation analysis. I hope that answers the question. And I should also point out with that there's a paper that we relied heavily upon for those methods. It's cited down here at the bottom, and it basically walks through exactly how to do this exact question. And so that was our reference for how to develop these methods.
Great. This is a question that, both I have, and there's another question here about seasonality that we got before the session. And, I noticed that your baseline and end line was about a year apart, but not exactly. So it was like 1 month after, right? And so the question is about seasonality and what do you think your study shows about seasonality in this context? And also just specifically, given that your end line was 13 months out, did you find, it's kind of arbitrary to say a month represents a whole season, but you know what I mean.
Sure.
Just speak to that briefly.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of people listening can relate to the fact that we had intended for it to be approximately exactly 1 year, but we faced some delays, and so our inline survey, as you point out, was a bit over 1 year after the follow-up. But more or less, we think that in terms of the food security of the communities at that time, we think that the inline and the baseline surveys were similar. But we did control for covariance in these models, and I know this isn't the question, but just to point out that we did control for the baseline status. And so we hope that, adjusts for any imbalances that might have been there at baseline in the food security status of the households. In terms of the seasonality, so our midline survey, which is where we saw the strongest effect of the project, was during the food insecure season. And that is also where we saw that the project had a beneficial impact, or was perhaps you could say protective against food insecurity. But it's interesting because we didn't see the individual household food security status having a relationship with the complementary feeding outcomes, except for dietary diversity, which I think is also an interesting finding, that we see that for dietary diversity, but not for other complementary feeding practices. But what this says is that the communities at the midline survey, regardless of the individual households, the communities were experiencing their food insecure season. And so I think it gets to what we're measuring when we use something. In this case, we used the food insecurity experience scale to measure individual household food insecurity. But in general, we were talking about food insecure communities. And so to me, what this says is that food insecure communities, and this reinforces what we found in formative research in the project design phase, is that food insecurity is a barrier to improved complementary feeding. But it's possible that with caregiver nutrition education and other interventions in place, that tendency that households may have to cut back in terms of complementary feeding could be overcome, potentially. I'm extrapolating a bit here, but certainly a strong seasonal effect. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Emily. There's another interesting question from Fanny, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the next presenter and we'll come back to your question hopefully in the end. So with that, thanks, Emily. And I would like to introduce our next speaker, Pepin Scheinemakers, who is going to talk to us about promoting healthier food choices among children, an innovative strategy for combining school and home gardens. And so we've heard a lot about home gardens over the years, and this is an interesting study on combining both home gardens as well as school gardens. And I will hand over to Pepin.
Okay, thank you. Let me share screen. Okay, thanks for that introduction. School gardens, it's working. School gardens have become quite popular in both higher income countries and lower income countries to promote healthier eating among children. Now, previous studies have shown that knowledge of children and even the preferences for healthier foods is improved by those programs. What is missing, however, from the literature is that these programs show a strong link to actually improved healthier food choices among children. Now, one of the reasons that there's a lack of impact on these of school gardens on like actual food choices is perhaps of two reasons. First reason is that often there's a low availability of healthier foods in children's homes. So although children know that they want to eat healthier food or know about healthier foods, the healthier food is just not available in their homes. Another reason is often that parents don't have the same behavioral change that children experience and don't see the need for buy healthier foods like vegetables or fruits need to be served within the household as part of the household meals. Now, what this study tried to do is to test these hypotheses. And basically what we did is we said like, okay, school gardens will lead to healthier food choices among children if making healthier foods available in children's homes and if also stimulating parents to eat healthier. Now, we did that by using an experimental design in Nepal, as shown in the next slide, in which we combined a school garden design, which includes nutrition education and gardening, with a home garden intervention, which also includes nutrition education and gardening for the parents. So both children and parents basically got a very similar type of interventions, one at the school and one at the community level. We then used we use a randomized control trial design that is clustered at the village level. So we started with 52 eligible schools in one district in Nepal. We selected 30 schools from that group and allocated 15 to the treatment group and 15 to the control. In the treatment and control, we had a sample of 450 children and their parents. Now, the main result of this study, and there's several results, but the main one is that the intervention did increase the proportion of children, proportion of the children's meals that include vegetables, and that we used monthly data. We had baseline data and endline data, but also we collected monthly food data using a 24-hour recall method. And there we see that depending a bit on the quarter of the season, but an increase in the between 15 and 26% of the proportion of the meals that included vegetables. It's not all highly significant, but at least the quarter 3 is like significant at 5% and the others at 10%. So this leads to the conclusion of the study that for school gardens to affect children's food behavior, it may be important not to only train children in gardening and nutrition, but also their parents. Thank you.
Thanks, Pepin. Let's start off. There's a question in the chat box about whether the vegetables grown in the home gardens and the school gardens, whether they were native to the diet. And so maybe we can start off with that question from Catherine.
Yeah. Partly so, but we have to realize that the diets in the mountainous areas of Nepal are very have a lack of diversity of different vegetables. So there's basically 3 vegetables that are commonly eaten, but a lot of diversity that we find in other areas are not very common. So we did try to actually increase the diversity of vegetables.
Thanks. And this is a bigger picture sort of question, Pepin, and maybe you saw this through the intervention of the trial and you could help answer it. It's just that, there's a lot of complex nutrition programs, and especially in the context of Nepal, we see that, with Suhara and things. And while it seems logical to make these interventions consistent across various spaces, is it not challenging to both collocate and combine all these different interventions without overburdening delivery staff? And also, how would you suggest the potential for diluting interventions by spreading them too thin? Or rather, do you think that happens? Yeah, so if maybe you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, but I think the study actually shows the opposite, because if you implement intervention as a standalone intervention without strongly involving the community and the parents, we see maybe that it doesn't have an effect on the nutritional outcome indicators. So it is actually important to think more about holistic interventions that include both individual as well as community level interventions. So I think that our study kind of argues for even making a bit more holistic or more complex interventions. Don't go for the very simple ones.
Okay. And related to, there's two related questions I see here about measurement of yields. Helen Harris-Fry is asking about that. And related to that is Anna Herforth's question about what was the uptake rate for the home garden piece, and did everyone actually do it, and were they happy to? So if you could respond to those questions.
Okay, you have to repeat the first question. It wasn't clear to me.
Yeah, how did you measure yields coming off from the gardens? What kind of metric did you use?
Well, I didn't show in either of these in my short film. So we didn't, yields is measured as just at baseline and end line, as kind of the total amount of vegetables harvested, but actually measured as a total number of vegetables grown, because it's very difficult for households to actually estimate the yields as kilograms per hectare for a home garden that is just a few square meters in size. So that's not a key indicator for us, yield as such. The second question, I didn't write it down.
Well, first, can I just ask a follow-up question about the yields then? Even if you measured by vegetable, was there any assessment of quality then, for example?
In terms of, we looked at vegetables grown, and there was a significant number of different vegetables grown. So we didn't look at the quantity of vegetables. Okay.
And with Anna's question, the second question I asked you was, what was the uptake rate for the home gardens piece? Did everyone actually, participate in the home gardens, and were they happy to participate and do so, given that gardening takes quite a bit of effort?
Yeah, it did take quite some effort, and of course there's a lot of variation between households. Some especially mothers, are very highly interested in this. Most of them really appreciated the ability to grow more different vegetables, as I said, like often in Nepal we find the leafy mustard as kind of very common vegetables, but for them to be able to grow things as carrots or cauliflowers or like fenugreek, like it's also kind of common in Nepal, but they were not aware that they could actually grow it in their location, so they kind of appreciated that. So we had a high participation rate and a high interest in this project. Now I don't have exactly the statistics in front of me, how high was the uptake of home gardens. Of course, we have to realize that many households do already have some kind of a home garden in those locations. So we're talking more about an improvement of home gardens than the adoption of a home garden as such.
Okay, and I wonder whether I have to pick just one question to close, but there are a few overlapping questions here from Archana, from Naba, and I believe someone else about sustainability. Like, how would you rate the sustainability of such a intervention, and how could one ensure sustainability?
Yeah, very important question, thanks. Well, literature is emerging that home gardens are kind of more sustainable than we initially thought. That actually, after some years, and last year I presented some evidence there also, that actually after several years, the intervention has stopped, that they actually continue the households. For school gardens, this is quite different, because school gardens need a bit of resources. So I think for school gardens, only to be sustainable, there are two pathways. Either the community can take it up and see some incentive there to improve child health through to working with the school and supplying vegetables, or the government has to initiate a national program or a regional program on school gardening. And of course, we are hoping for this, or considering this, if this is possible for a low-income country, to support the school garden program. And what are the costs and the benefits of doing that?
Okay, because you're succinct with your answers, I will ask you two more questions related to just the interventions themselves that seems to be coming up from different participants, which is, if you could just speak to the types specifically of vegetables that were promoted in this intervention to be grown, but also about, I'm trying to Yes, and also about if you could speak to the intervention related to education, nutrition education. How exactly was it implemented? Were children and parents trained separately or together?
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I should have explained it a bit better. So for the children, we had developed a 23-week kind of curriculum. So there's a booklet that the children, the classroom teacher kind of runs the children through on a weekly basis. So they have 1 to 2 hours a week. They work on that kind of workbook. For parents, it was different because we used it in the group sessions. So the parents, kind of mostly the mothers actually, gathered there on a monthly basis to learn about nutrition as well as gardening topics. So that's the educational component. So there's an overlap, but not exactly the same materials. In terms of the vegetables that were promoted, now I don't also have the list exactly in front of me, but as I said, mustard greens, fenugreek as leafy vegetables. We had spinach in there, and then carrots, cauliflowers, and broccoli we tried in some households. So it's not all the same, and they got a package about I think 9 to 10 vegetables for the winter season, and again 9 to 10 different vegetables for the summer season. So the two different vegetables. Right.
Right, great. Thank you so much, Kevin. I think we would need to move to the next presentation. There are a lot of questions, so either we come back or also if you can take note of them, I think we would, and feel free to respond to them in the chat box, Kevin. The next presenter I'd like to introduce is Srujana Medati, who is from the National Institute of Nutrition, ICMR. She'll be talking to us about a great proof of concept here, the impact evaluation of micronutrient supplementation on nutritional status and oxidative stress of rural farm children in Telangana state in India. This is work Srujana did for her dissertation, and so congratulations. And yeah, please take it away. You have 3 minutes. Srujana, are you there?
Yes.
Okay,
Sorry.
great.
Thank you, Shweta, for the kind introduction. So, this research was basically with the idea to understand the health status of the group which actually provide us the food, that is the farming community. So here we try to understand what are the risk factors associated with the farming community and how we can address them. So in this farming community, one of the major risks is the exposure to pesticides. So for this, there is an increase in the pesticide susceptibility, and there are other health effects caused due to that. So one of the most important key factor, the first one is the pesticide toxicity itself, which talks about inhibition of acetylcholinesterase enzyme and also cause oxidative stress. The second one is the micronutrient deficiency. The nutritional status will play a greater role for their defense mechanism. And also the third one is the age. Children are more prone to these chemical contaminants because of their body size, body physiology, and also weaker immunity when compared to adults. So we tried to evaluate the impact of micronutrient supplementation on the nutritional status and also the oxidative stress among rural farm children. The study was actually conducted in the Telangana Telangana state in the southern part of India. And this study, it involved 3 phases. The first line was the baseline study, which was conducted among children who were involved in the farming activities and helping their families or parents during these activities. Pre-tested questionnaire was taken, and this information was collected. Around 129 children were taken into the study, and blood samples were collected, and various analysis of pesticide residues, serum vitamin and mineral levels, ACHE activities, and oxidative stress parameters were analyzed. They were given a micronutrient supplementation for about 30 days, and a follow-up study was conducted, and all these parameters were again repeated. This analysis was conducted. Finally, appropriated statistics were done to understand the results. Here we can see the pesticides residue results. The pre-supplementation among the 9 to 12 years children, they have around 5 types of pesticide residues. However, during the post-supplementation, the number of residues have actually decreased. The same scenario was seen among the 13 to 15-year children. With respect to vitamins and mineral levels, we can see there was an improvement in vitamin E levels after the supplementation. However, A and D levels were not significantly changed. With respect to minerals, all the minerals in the study, like which we have studied, like the copper, zinc, magnesium, manganese, there was an improvement after the supplementation. However, calcium did not show any significant increase. Then there was also increase in or improvement in the oxidative stress parameters also. So to conclude, we can say that this micronutrient supplementation would actually enhance the metabolism in these subjects, and of course it will improve the micronutrient status. And also there was an alteration in the oxidative stress, and the inhibition of ACH activity was decreased. So overall it actually showed the micronutrients would actually help in improving the overall health status among these rural farm children. So this was the study conducted, and I thank you all for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Srijana. So for you, I'm going to start off the opposite way with a big picture question. And it's also tied to the intervention that that you tested here, which is that you use micronutrient supplementation for 30 days. I wanted to ask, how did you decide on, since it was just a 30-day period, what you feel the longer term impacts of this might be, but also what you see the role of supplementation being in the long term given your findings. And this is a highly contested topic, I think, amongst our community as well, as we try to move to more food-based interventions. Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts about what you think about supplementation for the long term.
Yes. Thank you. That was an interesting question. So it's obvious that for our community, we decide that nutritionist diet or improvement in the diet would be the key contribution to improve any nutritional status or health status of the individual. But these are some groups which are obviously they are at a lower economical status. Most of the families under the farming community, that was one of the important factor where it actually influences their food habits. And the second part is the pesticide exposure. So they are prone to other health effects when compared to any other individual because of their occupation, because of the proximity of their living. So here having an intervention study where we can actually develop or suggest a good nutrition based diet is a challenge. So yes, that would obviously be the first preference if you can ask from any nutrition side of us. So yes, that would be the first preference. But these are the subjects who are at a very vulnerable stage, considering their proximity, considering their area of living, consider their occupation, considering their economical status. So having all these factors, so we thought, let us have just a very small intervention period that is only for 30 days, and let's see would this actually be any helpful to these subjects. And if you consider talking about a longer run influence of these, so the micronutrient supplementation would not, we cannot suggest it for a longer run for sure. But however, if it actually inhibits or it actually alters this oxidative stress levels in the humans, so that would actually be beneficial, because oxidative stress on a longer run is known to cause many other NCDs, the non-communicable diseases. So that can be inhibited or stopped during these early stages of their life. So that is one way we can address in this way. But however, even though I have done this micronutrient supplementation as a nutritionist, I would not recommend that. But yes, this was the whole idea behind this concept. Thank you.
No, I think that's a really important response, right? And how to balance the issues of public health problems of now versus how we're thinking about it for the longer term. And so thank you for that. And also you've sort of addressed another question that has come up somewhere across my different chats about just, if you could describe the baseline characteristics of this community, and you've done so in your response about, who this sample is really. So I think you answered also a question from Brian with your answer. So I'm going to ask a question from Deepak, who asked, how do you see micronutrients so that's also similar, sorry, to the one that you've just answered. Let's take a question from Naomi. were you able to attribute causality between micronutrient supplementation and decreased oxidative stress? And if so, could you speak to that?
Yes. So this was a kind of a preliminary study. I would just like to add, because these kind of interaction and these kind of studies were not conducted elsewhere or previously, and these kind of interactions were not studied. But yes, we tried to understand, like, a one-on-one basis correlation studies were actually conducted with the pesticide residues which were detected in the subjects, and also with the oxidative stress levels, whatever was the alteration. And yes, few of these, they could actually be directly linked with the pesticide residues and also oxidative stress. However, that is a very detailed study, and I have not presented that here. But we have studied also the correlations between the micronutrient status also with oxidative stress, and that kind of study was done, and a positive result were found. So that can be an answer, I guess.
Thank you. There's another question from Nikhil, who asks, what do you think about reducing the exposure to pesticides, and a recent goal ordered on banning the government of India ordered on banning 27 pesticides nationwide?
So pesticides as such is a very controversial topic to talk about. So that would be my first answer. So the thing is, even though there is a ban of pesticides and everything is done at a government level, at the authoritative level, but when you go to the ground level, the grassroots level, you see there are pesticides which are being used by the farming community, and they have their own, factors, and they have to use this for pesticides to get a good yield, and that is their livelihood. So they don't care about their health effects among the consumers also. They just prefer to have a good produce at the end of the day. So that is their target. So yes, there were studies which have been done where the knowledge or the awareness about these health effects have been told to the farming community, and all these kinds of studies where use of PPEs, protective devices, were also done, and all these studies are being going on. But here we try to address them in the other way, that is improving their health status. So however is the exposure, if we cannot, we cannot control this indiscriminate use of pesticides in the farming, can we improve ourselves, or can we improve our nutritional status and deal with these adverse health effects? That was the question of this research.
Thank you so much, Srijana. This is really interesting, and I hope you get a chance maybe to scale up and look at some causal linkages as well. So thank you so much. And we're going to move to the next presenter, our last but not least final presenter for this session, Tracy Morse, who's from the University of Strathclyde. And her presentation is titled A Combined Complementary Food Hygiene and Wash Intervention to Reduce Diarrheal Disease in Rural Malawi. And so we have Tracy joining us. Okay.
Please stop speaking. Sorry, I'm having a numpty moment here where I forgot to unmute myself. There we go. Can you see the screen? Can you see the presentation now?
So we can hear you, but we can't see your presentation. Yeah.
Sorry. Well, see, the one person who's talking to you from the long way where you're all supposed to be, and I'm making a mess of sharing my screen. There you go. All right. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, that should be working now. Okay, great. So yes, it's just started raining in the long way, so I'm really hoping it's going to stop just now. You won't be able to hear me. So I'm just going to share very briefly the highlights of our combined wash and complementary food hygiene intervention that we undertook in 2018-2019 here in Malawi. This was a before and after trial with a control, which was called the Hygienic family. We wanted to ensure that it encompassed all members of the family and not just those caregivers who are often targeted, being that the men hold the purse strings on some of the interventions we expected them to implement. One treatment group was focused on food hygiene only, obviously in combination with hand washing with soap. And the other group also included 2 wash components of feces management, which included animal and human feces management, and water management, but only in the case of safe storage and not in terms of providing any kind of treatment at household level. So just to quickly focus on the health outcomes for today, at baseline we didn't have any significant difference between the control and treatment group. See at the end line a significant difference between those controls and those in the 2 treatment groups, but as you can see there is not a particular difference between the 2 treatment areas, indicating that food and hand washing with soap potentially had a much more significant impact on reducing diarrheal disease in this particular population. Our linear model didn't identify any particular variable that was responsible. So being part of the intervention as a whole seemed to be the factor which led to disease reduction. And in keeping with a lot of the studies that have come out recently, like WASH benefits and SHINE trials, we think that this is probably due to a number of marginal gains over multiple components rather than one particular behavior. So in terms of implications, this was a behaviour-centred design, and I think as some of the other speakers earlier have also touched upon, it seemed to have a much more significant impact on, in this case, diarrheal disease reduction. Food hygiene is often overlooked in both nutrition programmes and in WASH programmes, and we're really calling for that to be integrated more effectively in future. We had a mixed method. We spoke to people through open days, through cluster group meetings, not unlike caregiver group meetings, for example, with Scaling Up Nutrition. And we also had household visits, and that combination of methods seemed to have a much more, an improved impact on engaging with caregivers and seeing behaviour change. And that was done through local structures that were available, not through a research team. And so we've kind of demonstrated that that's feasible, albeit with adequate support and supervision. We've also measured other benefits, and I think we often talk about the health benefits, but there are other wider benefits to these programs, such as social capital, improvements, building relationships between caregivers within the community as well, which we've published elsewhere, but just to touch on maybe encouraging people to measure those and not just focusing on health outputs in the future. Okay, and just for me to say thank you to the fantastic team who do all of this great research here with me in Malawi.
Great, thanks Tracy. You were spot on time.
Was I? That
it is a technological mishap, so you're good. So the first question's coming from Joe Sturgis. And how did you identify local structures?
Okay, so when we undertook about 9 months of formative research before we implemented the actual intervention, and part of that formative research was to understand what structures are in place already. So we've worked in communities in southern Malawi for about 20 years, so have quite a good understanding of what's already in place in terms of village health committees and water point committees and those kind of groups. But we also wanted to understand what other informal structures were in place and what kind of social networks were valuable to the caregivers we worked with. So we also did a network analysis with the caregivers to understand who they would trust in terms of providing information, which helped decide how to develop the intervention structure. So we then went on to use women within the community as, I'm loath to say community volunteers because they were paid, and I'm a great advocate that if you're asking someone to do work, you should pay them. So we used community key informants, as we called them, to implement the program, which is not dissimilar to, for example, someone who leads a caregiver group or a mother and child health group. And they were employed as people who were already trusted voices in the community. Oh,
thanks, Tracy.
Have I gone away?
There's a few questions here. So again, related to the interventions, and I think people want, you know, some details. So what were the specific WASH interventions and whether clean water is readily available in your study context? I'm just going to quickly check here if there's any other, no, so there's no other intervention related question. If you could just speak to that.
No problem. Because we wanted to particularly be able to measure the impact of the behaviours, our households that were included within the study lived within 500 of a protected water source and had a toilet. All of the areas that we did the study in were open defecation free, because we wanted to remove those as confounding factors in terms of the results. So everyone in theory had access to clean water, certainly at source, but obviously as I think we probably all know on this call, that water is very, it would be unusual for that water to still be safe from fecal contamination by the time it's stored in the household. So our focus on, for example, water was to look at safe collection, safe storage, and how you then decant that water and use that water within the household. In terms of feces management, it was looking at child stool management. Certainly in Malawi, there's a great belief that children, especially when they're under the age of 6 months, that their stools cannot carry pathogens. So it was about understanding the risks around child stools, making sure that they were disposed of safely and properly. But we also know that, you know, with this particular area where the study took place is pretty much free range farming, goats, chickens, cattle. So there's a lot of fecal contamination from household animals as well that we needed to control for. So the feces management was around both human and animal feces. Obviously the hand washing with soap crosses between food hygiene and other behaviours. So there were critical times when hands needed to be washed around food preparation, but other times as well after defecation and things, for example. And when it came to a lot of hand washing facilities put up around like community-led total sanitation programs tend to be located next to the latrine, for example, but people don't want to go to the latrine to wash their hands if they're preparing food. So it was looking at how we could adapt the structures, put in place as prompts and nudges to improve hand washing at the actual food preparation area and have those facilities more readily available. That was more information than you asked for, but there you go.
Fine. So some study design and methods questions is, you know, whether if you could just reiterate whether this was a cluster randomized trial, I think, and I believe it was. I just wanted to have you explain that if you need to, just very briefly, but also about whether you could speak to how the non-health benefits of this trial was measured.
So I'm loath to call it a randomized cluster trial because we actually separated our populations by geographical area, because the villages in this particular area are so close to each other. There would be quite a overwhelming spillover effect if we tried to put different interventions in. Our control area was about 50 kilometers away from the actual intervention sites, and the two treatment areas were separated by about 6 kilometers. So the villages were, the women worked in clusters. They were in clusters of up to about 25 caregivers with a lead caregiver who did the training and education. But the actual, in terms of the trial design, they were geographically split. And the other question, which I've forgotten, sorry.
The non-health benefits, how were the non-health benefits measured?
Yes. So the non-health benefits were measured through focus group discussions and through, so we used something called the RANISC model, the risks, attitudes, norms, abilities, and self-regulation, developed by AVAG in Switzerland to look at behavioural factors. So a lot of the issues around mental health, around non-health benefits were measured using that model, but we also conducted a series of focus group discussions with our health workers who implemented, as well as the community key informants and the beneficiaries and community leaders to measure their and validate the findings of those surveys as well.
Okay. I'm going to have one more question for you, and then I'm going to move to Brian, who is asking a question more broadly to the panel. But So one question for you is that, you know, I'm sure you've read a lot of the SHINE work and the WASH benefits trials and sort of what their take-home messages were. And they use this word called transformative WASH. Do you feel like your interventions were transformative, or, you know, and how is it different or not? And perhaps even just from running the study, you know, perhaps insights on what could be done really differently, because it does seem like we're coming up on the same, well, your results were more positive than some of the results we've seen, right? Which is great, and it'd be interesting to see, hear why you think that. But yeah, I think I just wanted to, you know, to have you answer that larger question.
Yeah, and I think it's really challenging. It's been very challenging for those of us who work primarily in the WASH sector, you know, when large trials come out and say, oh, well, actually, what you're doing is pointless. And I think this kind of now discussion around what does transformative WASH mean, because often when people say transformative, it sounds like we need all kinds of new technologies and exciting things. But I'm a great believer that transformation in this field really just means better integration. It means that we need to improve how we engage WASH with food hygiene, with nutrition, with agriculture, with you know, all of the different determinants of health, rather than just trying to put things into a box and perhaps only deal with diarrhea or malaria or undernutrition. That in itself is incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging. And I think any kind of transformation we could achieve in that integration would make a massive difference to what we can achieve.
Thanks for that, Tracy. So I'm going to invite all the speakers to come back on. To maybe unmute yourself. But there is this question from Brian, and I'll ask it, or if Brian is around and wants to ask it himself, please feel free to. Is Brian around? Can't seem to.
I don't think so. I don't see him on the participant list.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, I'll ask
if you've left, you don't get your question answered.
Oh, he's saying he's not allowed to mute himself, he says.
Unmute, but I can't. What is his name? Because I have a lot of participants here. I cannot. Oh, Brian, I just spelled it wrong.
Yeah.
Got it. Sorry. One second.
Yes.
Okay. So Brian, you can unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow, this is very exciting. Thank you for taking my question. Thank you to all the participants and the organizers of this event, and both your adaptation to the current pandemic, as well as just, you know, being open and making this a participatory event. I think you guys are doing a great job, and I'm really excited to be a part of this. My question is related to chronic versus acute foodborne hazards, and obviously there's a combined effect between those, but I think often the focus of our intervention programming is on the acute side of our of foodborne hazards, but I think, you know, we're really missing a lot of the chronic exposure that may be driven by market forces and not necessarily, and certainly not as easy to control at the household level. And so I'm just curious, as we're thinking about our epidemiological models and the drivers for the health impacts of food safety, where we can, I don't know, like what are how we can promote the greater need and understanding to include chronic foodborne hazards in our programming. And I know that may bias the response a little bit more, but yeah, I just am curious if the panel could comment on that.
I think, shall I say something to that? I think you're quite right. And I think in terms of chronic foodborne hazards as well, we tend to ignore it was great to see the pesticides presentation before mine, because we tend to not talk about the chemical contamination of food as well, a lot of the time, because it's very difficult to measure and it's expensive to study. So I think there is definitely a need. I think there is an appetite now for looking more in depth at foodborne hazards, whether they be acute or chronic. across the board. And I think it's becoming easier for us to be able to do that with the technologies that are now available in terms of assessing the quality of foods and what's there and what kind of diseases people are suffering from. How we get that into policy and into more practice and strategy, I'm not sure. I think that needs a wider voice and definitely more champions to be arguing the case. I'm not sure that answered your question, but just my opinion.
Anyone else from the panel want to respond to Brian's question? Okay, so I'm going to ask a question. This is for, I'm trying to figure out which of the many studies. So I believe this is for the Upavan trial, which is, did you explore reasons for the results regarding women's decision-making? That is why there was just an improvement in the agri arm alone. That's the right trial. Am I in the right trial?
Yeah, that's right. I can quickly answer that to say, watch this space. Yeah, we're looking at the process evaluation results at the moment. And so implementing partners and Audrey from UCL are looking at that, Audrey Prost. So we look forward to sharing that with you soon. It'll be a separate publication. Don't know offhand, in short.
Excellent, thanks. Okay, and so this is another question for Pepin. Pepin, you had quite a few questions once you wrapped up. So I'll ask this question about how did you ensure continuous participation considering the terrain, they ask, and what were the perceptions among participants as they were able to, in terms of maintaining multiple gardens both at home and school? I think the second question maybe you've answered, but perhaps if you could just talk about continuous participation.
Yeah, so at the school level, that's relatively easy because you get support from the school principals. You have like a focal teacher, a science that kind of runs through the school year. Of course, for the home garden component, it's a bit more variable. That's some households maybe occupied with other tasks and don't give it priority. So there's some more variation here. But we did try to visit each household about once a month to get that continuity there, which is of course expensive to do that on the long term. But at least for the kind of the eight month period of the intervention, we did it every month. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Pepin. So I've been told that we have to wrap up the session, unless Sunita says that you all promise to see posters after the social hangouts, which, I mean, we could take a poll, but I do want to thank first, though, the panelists for your time and insights. And I will just say that as someone who has also been working on trying to understand some of these agriculture to nutrition pathways, I mean, the science has just like really evolved, and the fact that there's this many trials or even just about integrated approaches and even just proof of concepts, it's really, really quite amazing. So congratulations on all the rigor and just interesting findings that you're sharing and being very true to your data, I think, in your presentation. There wasn't too much of stretching or of your results and also backing up why you think your results might be important. And I think that was really great to see. I have been asked to please remind all of you to view the posters and to attend the social hangouts. There's been a lot of effort behind the scenes by the ANH Academy team, which are a lovely bunch of people. They're quite fun to hang out with in person. I'm sure they'll be fun to hang out in virtual land. And I think that might be it. If someone wants to stay on for some reason, or presenters want to stay on and chat with other participants, go ahead. But otherwise, I think we should wrap up now and to allow you to take a break and move on to your next session. I'm really happy to see all your faces, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
I'll just remind you that all of the resources in the poster hall it's quite wonderful, this interactive format. It can be found at anh-academy.org/ANH2020, and it's under the poster hall. Great.
Thanks for you should all know there's about 4 to 6 people behind the scenes here, just helping with this this one session. So thank you, and thank you, Talia, for being the session manager.
Of course, you're very welcome. Great job, everybody. Thank you so much to all the participants and the presenters.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes. Let's see.
Shweta gone? Oh, that was a great session. Okay. We can leave too, right?
I think so. Yeah, we'll have our debrief in another forum.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Nice to see Upwan family and everyone else. This is
Bye,
great.
guys.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.